Welcome to the BearFiction Podcast, Mount Juliet High School's podcast for student fiction. I'm your host, Jason Lawrence. Today, we'll be reading part 1 of the Sword of Light saga by Eric Duggar. We hope you enjoy. Part 1. William. It was late in the evening as William prepared the last few dishes for the day, mostly for traders that were getting into the village after a long day of selling and trading in the kingdom. William rarely ever bought anything from the traders, unless they were new spices or meats he could experiment with in his own time. This occurrence was somewhat rare. He'd been doing this for quite some time, after all. The restaurant smelled of the fantastic cuisine that they had been making all day, same as every busy day. There was a ceiling of smoke in the kitchen that flowed out through the kitchen window as soon as it had opened, along with the smell that William had grown accustomed to from the food cooked in the kitchen, like a snake slithering out of its burrow. He wiped his brow as he stepped out of the back alley, locking the door behind him as the stars in the sky blossomed, while the light of the sun slowly retreated from the ocean of space as it set. William took a deep breath of the cool, fresh night air as he left the back alley behind Ifplund, the restaurant he worked at. He went onto the street of the village where several people were wandering the streets, examining the merchant's stock and buying whatever their impulses told them. The townspeople were usually in the streets of Thud for about an hour after the merchants arrived back from the city, wandering from merchant tent to merchant tent, often with bags to hold things they bought. William often did this as well, leaving the entrance of the alley that he had emerged from and beginning to walk around. Despite it being night, the streets were well lit with lanterns and candles from the trader tents, as well as the lanterns the townspeople carried. William wandered along the street looking for tents that were selling anything culinary related. He soon stumbled upon a tent that was selling kitchen knives, wrapped meats, and some spices. He ducked as he entered the tent and loomed over the shopkeeper. He briefly looked over the items before locking his forest green eyes onto a set of butcher's knives and a cleaver. He pointed to them, speaking clearly to the man. "How much?" he asked in a booming voice, built by years of yelling across kitchens at his fellow chefs when they did something wrong. His deep voice briefly startled the merchant before he spoke in his own, somewhat raspy voice. "Yes, those will be 150 sigils," he said, as he pushed the knives as well as a scale. The scale held an ingot of dark red Drascus, with the word 50 etched on the top. The whole apparatus seated neatly across a table that blocked the entrance to his tent. William reached into his large apron pocket and pulled out 3 bags, each jingling loudly, with writing that said 50 on each of them in poorly written letters. He placed one bag on the side of the scale as the two of them locked eyes on it. The merchant smiled as he saw the scale go level. "Very well," the merchant said, as he took the pouch and held out his hand for the rest, which William steadily handed to him. He took the pouches before putting them in a chest behind him, getting a box and putting the knives in it. With the level of service he had received, William was almost surprised he didn't top the box with a bow. He placed the box firmly on the table, waving William off. William took the box with his right hand and walked off, checking his apron pocket and seeing how many more sigils he had left. He still had 5 bags, all jingling from side to side loudly as he walked, but he didn't want to spend it all in one night. He looked up at the sky. Crimson Minor, one of Odnia's smaller moons, glowed gently in the night sky. From its place in the sea of stars, William knew he had plenty of time to relax before sleep took him. He made his way down the street to his house, a single-story hut with a straw roof and wood plank walls, 2 windows on each side of the house with beige curtains on vertical hinges on either side of the windows. He walked up the steps of his home onto his porch that was lined with wooden fences and overlooked by a thatched roof. He opened the door and was welcomed by the warmth of his home, throwing off his apron onto hooks that waited by the door, sat next to them holding a dark green cloak and a bow and a quiver of arrows. He walked through the entryway, going through the living room to the kitchen where he set his knives on the counter. After this, he returned to the living room, where he set the fireplace alight and grabbed a journal from his large bookshelf. The bookshelf held many books with different timestamps on each of them, some dating back almost 300 years. Age had completely yellowed some of the tomes and covered them in dust to the point where the timestamps were almost invisible, while others looked newer, barely showing any significant signs of wear. He flipped his journal open, passing through hundreds of pages before stopping on the next blank spot. He raised his pen to the paper, writing the date, and moving down to the next line to write what had happened that day. He prepared to write about his average day at work and at the market before looking up towards his entryway, where he saw his bow and quiver, as well as his old cloak. He had decided to stop hunting after receiving an injury from a wild vuse 20 years ago. The injury had reminded him how lucky he was. Stories of these creatures bisecting even the best hunters of the native Ent tribes ran rampant in hunting circles. He lifted up his work shirt to look at his chest, staring at a large scar that stretched across the seafoam and sapphire scales that plated his chest. The wound stretched across his torso scales into the side of his abdomen, a constant reminder of what his life could have been if his parents had chosen to stay with the tribe. But not all his memories of the woodland tribe were bad. The scar he bore also reminded him of the rush that came from hunting. It reminded him of the ecstatic feeling he got when he whipped through the trees, when he found a target and tracked it through, and when his arrow struck his prey. He looked back up at his cloak. It was like it was calling to him, beckoning to him to use it after so long. He stood up from his seat, walked over to the cloak and bow, covered his work clothes with the dark green cloak, and slung the redwood bow and red leather quiver on his back before darting out of his door, looking around before starting his trek towards the woods. About an hour later, he had arrived at the Goshians, a vast forest with trees that looked as if they stretched miles high. He took one last look up at the vast ocean of stars and moons before unshouldering his bow, putting up the hood of his cloak, and walking into the woods. He was taken from a vast region of grass and hills overlooked by the beautiful moons of the world into a sea of twigs, dead leaves, and the occasional patches of grass, overlooked by hundreds of overlapping, drooping branches, interweaving into each other so much that not even as much as a single star could be seen through them. He was not discouraged by this. He ventured into the woods, where he would weave between trees swiftly and gracefully like a needle and thread through cloth. He knew how nimble and sharp the wildlife could be because of how often they were hunted by the native Ents. The Ents of the forest were formidable hunters of the wildlife, and they had adapted to it. Soon enough, he had set his eyes on a grias, a four-legged creature with black antlers and gray fur, a hoof on each leg, and 4 deep purple eyes adorning its head like jewels of a crown. He had already drawn an arrow from his quiver by this time, drawing it into the bowstring as he lifted it up, aiming at its head right between the antlers. He took a deep breath, not blinking or flinching at all as he released the bowstring from the strong grip of his fingers. The arrow whistled through the air as though it were a bolt of lightning, striking its target like thunder, the grias letting out a cut-off yelp as it dropped to the ground. William released his breath and ran to the now carcass of the animal, running his hand briefly across its fur. He drew his knife, raising it up and bringing it down on the shoulder of the carcass. It deflected, with a piercing, painful screech like metal grinding against metal, as if the flesh of the beast was made from the exact same material that the knife was trying to pierce it. It was after this horrible echoing noise had stopped that he heard something. A childish giggle and a deep tone played in his ears as he staggered up, looking around to see where the noise had come from, slowly looking back down to see the wound of the grias wasn't bleeding at all. Bending down to get a closer look, he examined the wound. It looked as if its head was totally hollow. Abruptly, he saw something with a yellow glow peer through the hole, the only thing not glowing being a pitch-black slit. The glowing thing receded before being replaced by a black substance spewing through the wound, a jet-black liquid ichor fountaining out before forming a puddle on the ground with a glowing yellow eye, the same one he saw through the wound, in the center of it. The eye locked on William, cueing him to drop his bow, quickly turn and begin running for his life. Behind him, the puddle of black liquid slowly formed into a humanoid creature with slender arms, 5 clawed and elongated fingers on each bony hand, long animal-like legs, and a beaming, glowing yellow eye on its head. Its slit pupil focusing on William again before the creature lurched forward and went into an animalistic dash. William weaved through the trees, left and right, but this thing was much faster, its long and slim legs making it agile and a natural predator. Its claws marking on trees as it bounded off of them towards William, getting ever closer with each long stride. A rumble sounded from deep within the forest, but neither he nor the creature could tell where from. William assumed that it was the trees rumbling as the creature bounced off of them, while the creature seemed to ignore it entirely. The chase continued as William could feel the creature's gaze drilling through his back, the glow of its eye producing a shadow on the ground, his own, with a yellow outline. The rumbling continued, on top of the creature's loud, booming footsteps behind him, and the same sinister, childlike giggle he had heard from before when the creature had originally emerged. Without warning, a searing pain ripped into William's back that rivaled the pain he felt 20 years ago. A warmth that somehow chilled him more than the cold night air trickled down his back as he kept running from the creature, losing his pace gradually until the creature managed another slash at his scaled back, drawing a second scream from his lips. He stumbled and tripped, falling down on his chest and providing the creature the chance to pin him there with its claws and malnourished hands wrapped around the back of his neck. It let out yet another giggle, this one louder and more booming than the first two, that shook the trees and almost made William's eardrums burst. Its eye gleamed down at him as he heard it speak in a deep, distorted voice. "You were quick. Now stop this foolish struggle and be my meal. You mortals have no chance against us." It was cut off by another deafening rumble, followed by a bright, blinding light. The creature let out a distorted scream, its voice slowly disappearing as Williams rose in response to the searing pain erupting through his core. His eyes widened as he arched in agony. Thunder blasted above him, and he went limp, an odd ball of light looming over him as his vision faded. He woke up to a blinding light. The sunrise? No. The sun was already up and barely shining through the clouds. So what was this? He stood up, grunting as he felt an aching torment in his core before remembering that he'd been attacked by something last night. He only remembered its dooming yellow eye. He looked around before locking his eyes on a floating orb of yellow and white light. His body was wobbly, and his vision was fuzzy, so it was hard to tell this orb was only merely a foot away from him. He reached out at the light deliriously and gasped as his hand phased through the ball of light. And not just that, it didn't appear on the other side. No, it was like the orb had eaten his hand. He gasped and pulled back, almost falling back before catching himself and walking forward to examine the orb. It was far too bright, and his vision was far too hazy for him to examine it visually, so he decided his only choice was to rely on his sense of feeling. Gathering his courage, he repeated the action that terrified him so much the first time, reaching into the orb, and felt his hand wrap around something. He instinctively pulled his hand, while it was still clenched, back out of the brilliant light. What came out was beyond anything he had ever seen, glowing bright as the day. Barely visible through the magnificent and glaring light was a sword. If you're interested in having your work read, please send a request to bearfictionmjhs@gmail.com. This podcast is exclusively student-written fiction, and we'd love to publicize your work. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Bear Fiction Podcast. We'll see you next time.